Welcome to the Schar School Power Lunch. This week, it's a roundtable on immigration policy. In a world where everything is in motion, people are increasingly expected to stay still. And yet, modernity has been characterized by mobility. The drivers of migration intensify. Labor, family, refuge, climate change, education, love. How will policy respond? How will strategy and order meet humanity? The Power Lunch welcomes Caitlin Dickerson, national immigration reporter for the New York Times and a political analyst for CNN. Jeff Flake, former Republican U.S. Senator representing Arizona and a former congressman who represented Arizona's 1st District for 12 years. And Krishanti O'Mara Vignarajah, president of LIERS, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, and former policy director for First Lady Michelle Obama. Hello, it is the policy issue that drove Donald Trump into office, that drove the British out of Europe, and that ushered in an era of populism that realigned Western politics in irreversible ways. Because it is inherently about the movement and settlement of human beings, immigration is an issue that touches all human matters. Immigration is also, of course, with the spread of COVID-19 and its economic fallout, it's possible that this once pivotal political issue has also been marginalized. Welcome to the Power Lunch. I'm Justin Guest, Associate Professor here at the Schar School of Policy and Government. I'm delighted to be joined today by a fantastic panel of Caitlin Dickerson, Senator Jeff Flake, and Krish Vignarajah. Senator Flake is joining us all the way from Hawaii. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us from the East Coast as well. Caitlin, I'd like to start with you. Immigration is a subject matter filled with so many ironies, of course, and perhaps the most poignant is that after years of bluster about a wall and tougher regulations, some of Donald Trump's most draconian actions to halt the flow of immigrants to the United States took place when the issue was sidelined by the onset of the coronavirus pandemic, when almost no one was looking. What actions that were taken during the pandemic, and what are the downstream effects of these on the U.S. immigration system?
Well, you're right, Justin, that the administration, for all of its restrictive policies, I think implemented the most significant one during the pandemic, which might seem surprising to some people, but it actually made perfect sense to me, because we've known now for a long time and reported at the New York Times on how, as soon as President Trump was elected, before he even took office, his chief policy advisor on immigration, Stephen Miller, really just went through the federal code with a fine-tooth comb and found every possible opportunity for the use of executive power to limit immigration, and started drafting executive orders, started drafting federal regulations, and then sort of just plugging and playing with the help of White House counsel, who were letting him know, when various policies would be most opportune to be introduced, when the political climate and context would allow for those to pass the legal tests necessary to put them into place. And so this restriction that we're talking about, the closure of the border related to the pandemic, was not a new idea. It was one of those early ideas that Stephen Miller came up with, and he tried to introduce it several times based on this argument that the border needed to be closed because of public health and public safety. And he had tried when there was a flu outbreak in detention centers. He tried when other infectious diseases spread around immigration detention centers. But in each of those cases, White House counsel basically advised him that the public health threat was not significant enough to support a border closure. And so when the pandemic came around, that was his opportunity. It wasn't a new idea, but it was a new opportunity. In terms of whether the impact of that closure can be reversed, yes, Joe Biden, the president-elect, has not said affirmatively that he plans to reverse this border closure. And I think that's because that doing so could lead and very likely would lead to a massive surge on the border. And so that's a big challenge that the next administration is confronting, and we'll just have to see what they decide.
Caitlin, I think that one of the most surprising facts that one can share with more casual political observers of immigration policy is that despite one of the most active immigration policy agendas in US history, that no significant act of immigration legislation was actually passed under President Trump. All 400 actions were by executive authority, which theoretically makes them all reversible. But policy can be sticky, right? To what extent are these 400 actions actually reversible? And what should we expect from the Biden administration?
I think when it comes to the letter of the law, or as you pointed out in this case, not necessarily law, but executive order, policy, federal regulation, a lot of the changes that this administration has implemented can be reversed, and will likely be reversed. Many of them, having to do with things like a travel ban, and other restrictions on immigration, legal immigration from very specific parts of the world, as well as actions that have created an increase in very aggressive enforcement policies on the streets against immigrants already living in the United States who don't have legal status, whether we're talking about policy changes that have influenced asylum seekers or other forms of legal immigrants who are looking for employment-based visas or family-based visas. I think a lot of these policies can and will be rolled back. But I know you're talking about the stickiness of regulation, and there is a delay, and delays will happen. But I think the more significant sort of stickiness is the sort of soft power that U.S. immigration policy has around the world. When a policy is changed, it influences at a macro level, many people's decisions, again, whether they're refugees or whether they're people who are looking to become entrepreneurs and work internationally or work in technology. When individuals change their decisions on a large scale and new flows of immigration open up to different places in Western Europe or in Canada, then migration flows and the resources that support them toward the United States start to dry up. And I think those are going to be the more difficult impacts to reverse down the line because of the sort of ripple effect and the chilling effect that these more restrictive immigration policies that President Trump has introduced have had abroad.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. Senator Flake, you were one of 4 Republicans in the Gang of 8, which tried to pass comprehensive immigration reform in 2013. It was narrowly unsuccessful for a number of reasons, but one of them was the anti-immigrant fervor on the far-right fringes of the Republican Party. And Donald Trump pursued his agenda in many ways to appeal to that fringe, and a party for whom immigration was, for much of his presidency, the #1 political issue or problem in their minds facing the country. Among the Democrats who elected Joe Biden, immigration doesn't even crack the top 10 issues in political saliency. What do you think that means for its importance to President Biden's or President-elect Biden's legislative agenda? Senator Flake, I'm not sure if you might be muted right now, but we're having trouble hearing from you. I'll just remind our audience that you are very far away on the other side of the earth right now, so it might be a small technical glitch. We can't hear you, Senator Flake. We may try to work on Senator Flake's audio. I think we can actually take this question over to Krish, if that's okay, Krish. This is something that you have thought about, of course, yourself, and I know Caitlin is also following these issues too, while Senator Flake works on his audio. Have either of you thought about this as well? I mean, Krish, you're very close, obviously, with the Democratic Party, both at the national level and obviously at the state level. Democrats, while they care passionately about immigration, in terms of its rank order on the priority list, it's much lower than it is for Republicans, for whom many of them it's a number one issue.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. One of the things I think Democrats need to recognize and act accordingly is, obviously there's a lot on the Democratic agenda. Now the President-elect Biden will be in the White House, and there are many policy areas, of course, that demand immediate action. But we do still see, I think, immigration moving forward within the Democratic Party and the Biden administration for a couple reasons. President-elect Biden has been vocal in terms of his support for immigration reform. And I also think that there is a opportunity for true bipartisanship, even under a divided government. But in terms of kind of what Democrats need to do, I think part of it is the Democrats need to leverage the popular support for immigration into effective bipartisan legislation. While some of the past, the worst of the past 4 years can be reversed through executive action. As Caitlin noted, recent reporting has shown that, it might not be as simple as it initially seems. So we need to look at what legislatively can be done. Part of this involves reframing. We need to divorce ourselves from the notion that immigration is something that Democrats support and Republicans oppose. And obviously, Senator Flake's participation, as you mentioned, in prior legislation and, even attending this panel, I think reflects that. So in terms of really mobilizing, action, I do think we need to not just kind of embrace the norms behind this issue, but also recognize that, immigrants are on the front lines fighting the pandemic, right? They're 73% of agricultural workers. They're 29% of physicians and healthcare workers. And so trying to cast the issue in a more bipartisan frame, I think will help advance that agenda.
Caitlin, do you get the sense in your reporting that this is a priority for Democrats right now?
Let me unmute myself here. Do I get the sense in my reporting that it's a priority? I think it's something that's talked about a lot, but we will just have to see what happens. I have been doing immigration stories on and off for the last 10 years. And so I feel like I've been left at the altar a number of times where there will be all this momentum around major policy change, whether it's on a specific issue like helping kids who are brought to the United States, illegally as children, or who are known as dreamers, or whether we're talking about comprehensive immigration reform. You'll have all this political momentum, including on the part of Democrats, who you point out kind of suffer from this paradoxical reality, which is that when you look at polling, Democrats are incredibly unified when it comes to supporting various sort of humanitarian policies that support different groups of immigrants, dreamers, but also asylees and refugees. And they don't vote based on their views on immigration, and don't necessarily rally together based on their views on immigration. And that's understandable. As Krish pointed out, there are so many other issues that are top of mind and more personal for Democrats, but it's a difference. It's a paradox. So, we have this unification on the Democratic side of things around policy, and yet just a general lack of enthusiasm or a lack of movement. And I feel like Democratic elected officials have mirrored that sort of just difference of enthusiasm and momentum based on what's happening in the country. And so I really don't feel like I can predict whether Democratic lawmakers are going to really try to put forward major policy change. I think that when you look at the influence of some of the newer members of Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, and other new members of the House who are really enthusiastic and have pushed hard for changes when it comes to immigration enforcement policies. I think that their influence, as well as the influence of President Trump's most restrictive policies, have drawn the Democratic Party to the left to some degree. And so perhaps that will trickle down and make a significant impact in Washington. But I'm hesitant to say that we're going to see a Biden administration that's much more aggressive in terms of pushing for policy change than President Obama's administration, because I don't know what will happen, as a result of that disconnect that you raised.
Thanks, Caitlin. Let's see if we can bring Senator Flake back in. Aloha, Senator Flake. Can you hear us okay? I'm afraid we cannot hear you though. And so I think the audio issues are persisting, I'm afraid. We're gonna have to keep working on it. In the meantime, Krish, I want to return back to you because you are an immigrant yourself, a refugee more specifically. Your family fled civil war in Sri Lanka and brought you to the United States when you were just 9 months old. And now you run one of the largest refugee resettlement agencies in the country. Since President Obama raised the annual number of refugees to 110,000 in 2016, I think it's fair to say that the Trump administration has dismantled the U.S. refugee resettlement program, cutting off the pipeline of new arrivals. A question for you, I think, is what challenges does this component of immigration policy face to return to its former pre-2017 state? Are Trump's actions reversible here?
Yeah, let's certainly hope so. I do think they are. Ramping up refugee admissions is, of course, easier said than done, but it's well within the realm of possibility. And I think there are going to be really two big pieces of it. So the resettlement infrastructure here in the U.S. is kind of one part. It's how we, resettle, receive refugees. And then the other part is going to be kind of the government infrastructure, which is how refugees enter the system, are vetted, and ultimately accepted or denied admission. So LIRS is one of the 9 resettlement agencies that represent the national network that partners with the State Department. What we are currently undertaking is an effort right now to rebuild the resettlement infrastructure, but ideally not just revert to what it originally was, but ideally something that is better. This is a system that has been 40 years in the making that unfortunately has been decimated under Trump. So what we're working around is opening up more than 100 local offices that have been forced to shut down in the last 4 years. It's taking time, to rehiring qualified candidates. There are certain, paperwork, those sorts of things that you need to submit with the state and local offices. But then the other piece of this is going to be making sure that government is as functioning at the capacity. And so that means, prioritizing the federal workforce that's required to address the growing backlog in the U.S. resettlement pipeline, given the interaction between the State Department, DHS, Health and Human Services, the various intelligence and security agencies that vet the refugees. It has to be a whole of government approach. And I think that is where, it's going to take a little bit of time to put that in place. But I do think that there are going to be some real opportunities to ramp up in the next couple months.
Thanks, Krish. One interesting thing I think that people often don't realize about refugee resettlement agencies is that many of them, nearly all of them actually, have some religious roots. But devout Christians in particular are remarkably split on the issue of immigration. And on the one hand, the humanitarian teachings of Christianity are what has inspired so much help for the stranger. And beyond refugee agencies, a group like No More Deaths, which is a volunteer group that has provided food and water and medical aid to people who are crossing the U.S.-Mexico border through the Arizona desert. It was founded by an interreligious group of ministers. On the other hand, many evangelical voters largely vote for Trump. Do you mind talking a little bit about the dynamics of this split and the sort of ironies inside?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up my personal story because, I am a Hindu running a Lutheran organization. And I think that speaks to the fact that, it is obviously there's a faith component to it. 6 of the 9 resettlement agencies have some religious affiliation. When my family came to Baltimore, it was churches and temples that put clothes on our backs, coming from a tropical island and having never seen a winter or a snowflake. And that's, what gave Matthew, 25 in terms of welcoming the stranger significance to me. I think sadly, you do see religion being contorted to achieve kind of certain ends. Attorney General Jeff Sessions, for example, invoked the Bible in justifying family separation. And so, I think there is some difficulty in reconciling different interpretations that lend people to reaching polar opposite conclusions. But it's incredible because in terms of the faith-based involvement, it's not just refugee resettlement. When you look at the southern border, in terms of those asylum seekers who are coming across from Mexico and Central America, it is also an interfaith effort. We had a program, we called it our Welcome and Respite program, when the southern border wasn't shut. And it was Lutherans working alongside Episcopalians, working alongside Jews, working alongside those of non-faith, because so many faiths believe that they are called to welcome the stranger.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And, I think this also connects with some of the senator's background, and hopefully we can get him back in here. Senator, are you with us?
All right. Can you hear me now?
We hear you now, loud and clear, as if you're whispering to us on the beaches of Oahu. All right. We were just chatting about the religious roots of some of the refugee resettlement agencies, and how it's an interesting dynamic in immigration politics that the teaching of Christianity have led many Christians to open their doors and their hearts to many immigrants, right, on the one hand. And on the other hand, many of Trump's voters are, very devout evangelicals. And I was wondering if you might be able to speak a little bit to this too, because I know that your own religiosity has informed some of your opinions as well.
Oh, it has. I'm Mormon, or LDS, and the state of Utah, which is predominantly LDS, has had a very open policy and has been forward thinking on refugee resettlement. In fact, the governor wrote a letter to the president and said, please don't block refugees from coming here. And so, yeah, we've seen that. We've seen, and if I can go back to the first question you asked, in terms of the Senate and our effort there with the Gang of Eight, we were able to pass that legislation with the support of the Obama-Biden administration during that time. We passed it 68-32. It was in the House that the issue came up, and I still believe that were it not for Eric Cantor's loss, the majority leader who lost in a primary, which was really kind of attributed, I think, probably erroneously so, to immigration issues, then we would have had a good chance of getting it through. But as far as the environment now, it's extremely difficult. I just don't see much impetus to move ahead unless an issue like DACA, if the court comes back and says that it is unconstitutional and forces the Congress into action. I do think that there's a possibility that can be fixed in this environment, but moving forward legislatively is going to be difficult on the other issues. I think it's largely going to be an issue of enforcement and basically undoing, as you've talked about, a lot of what the previous administration has done.
Do you think that Christianity and religion more broadly is underutilized to try to persuade some Republicans in this way?
Yeah, I do. And I can tell you during the time of the Gang of Eight bill, there was a coalition that we tried to build of, people on the business side, people on the humanitarian side, people on the security side who wanted a more secure border. But also, importantly, it was faith groups. And they were represented and vocal and helpful in that arena. It's similar to other big issues that we've been able to do in Congress, like criminal justice reform. There was kind of the libertarians who didn't want to spend more money. There was people who, for social justice issues, really wanted to to get in there, but also faith groups who said we want to be able to enter the prisons and try to help with recidivism rates. And so, yes, and this is another area where religious groups, particularly with immigration, have traditionally been more supportive, and particularly on some of the enforcement issues, have kind of recoiled at some of the actions that this administration has taken.
As a Republican, or what used to be thought of as a Republican, you know your former constituents very well. And Democrats often have a hard time, I think, understanding the legitimate feelings that their countrymen have about border security and fairness. And they often attribute it to racism. But many Republican leaders have indubitably indulged these fears and employed racist tropes. I wonder how much of Republicans' concern with immigration border control is something that you think political officials, public officials have stirred. And maybe I can put this another way. If the Republican Party suddenly changed course and recognized the value and humanity of immigrants, do you think that their constituents would follow?
This is going to be tough. Right now, the base, I can tell you, the Republican Party is not in a place where, comprehensive immigration reform involving increased legal flows can happen. I think that they can be brought around, but it's going to take a lot of leadership on the part of Republicans to do that. But right now, the base of the party isn't there. You pointed out, during the last campaign, the president raised these issues. It was build the wall and the caravans. That was a big part of his 2016 effort, and to some extent in the midterms as well. But it really didn't rise to the level of being talked about in the campaign, in his campaign or any other campaigns that Republicans waged across the country. So I just, Republicans aren't feeling the pressure as much as they should, obviously from religious groups, from business groups and others. But I just don't see the impetus right now to push forward on a legislative level, unless the Congress is forced by the courts coming back, for example, as I mentioned on DACA.
Right. Caitlin, another perplexing constituency on immigration has been Latinos. And you and many others have written about the unexpected Latino support for Trump in 2020, driven particularly by Mexican Americans in South Texas, but also Cuban Americans and South Americans in South Florida. Many observers expected that Trump's rhetoric against Latinos and immigrants would turn off these voters. What did Democrats miss here?
That's a really important question, Justin. I think it's going to be the focus of a lot of political reporting in the next 2 and 4 years, especially. So I'll speak to what I know and what I've seen because I'm not a political reporter. And I think the biggest thing that we learned about Latino voters and Hispanic voters, which, as we know, are two different groups with some intersection, is that neither one of them is a monolith. That was the most important lesson, certainly, that I took away from my colleagues who cover politics in a much more nuanced and focused way than I do as an immigration reporter. That said, I'll speak to my experience on election night. I was in South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley, which got a lot of attention because it's historically been a very unified stronghold for Democrats, with a vast majority of an electorate that is Mexican American and Latino. And it's a place where President Trump in 2020 made significant gains. So President-elect Biden still won the majority of counties, but President Trump actually did win a couple of counties that he hadn't prior. And even in places where he lost by margins that were a lot more slim than they had been 4 years earlier. So I happened to that night have heard enough of an inkling that things might be changing, winds might be changing, that I spent most of the evening with Republican voters there. And they basically talked to me a lot about social issues. What they said was that in 2016, they felt that Hillary Clinton was much more qualified as a candidate. And so they voted for her in accordance with, their community and in accordance with the way that most of them had voted historically. Very turned off by President Trump's rhetoric the first time around, in particular with regard to immigrants, but also just a sort of lack of experience. And I think what happened was that they lived through the last 4 years, and practically speaking, felt that their lives were not negatively personally impacted by President Trump's policies. And as a result of that, they felt more comfortable this time around voting for a candidate with whom they felt more aligned when it came to social issues like abortion, like gay marriage, and like transgender rights. Those three issues came up in a lot of conversations for me very specifically, and are very important to Democratic voters in South Texas specifically, I think we can say. And, I do want to raise also something that some other reporters, Patty Mazzei at the New York Times specifically, has done a lot of really important reporting on, and we're just beginning to understand the influence of fake news, as they say, in the Spanish language media markets. We're just starting as journalists to dig in, and I think that area is worth a lot more attention. And so I just want to flag for people that in some of my conversations, I did have people say things like, I heard that, President-elect Biden, he wasn't at the time, but, wants to support legalizing pedophilia, or things that, clearly the president-elect has never supported or talked about. And I would say, where did you hear that? And they would say, oh, well, I saw it on Facebook, or I heard it on the radio. And so I think that is an area that's worth paying a lot more attention to. It might be that people were reading things that had to do with their views on social issues like abortion and gay marriage, but that were exaggerated, and that it perhaps impacted their votes.
Fascinating. Yeah, this is obviously a space to watch. Let me remind our viewers that you may ask questions at any time using the chat box. We'll review those questions and put them live on air towards the top of the hour. While immigration as an issue has dropped a little bit from public consciousness lately, there is still intense pressure on the incoming Biden administration to address the plight of the undocumented, and particularly the dreamers, people who have arrived to the United States undocumented as children with their parents and has since spent the rest of their lives in the United States. Krish, I want to turn to you here. How much should Joe Biden lean into this issue early in his presidency when he has so many other pressing matters to address? Is this where he wants to spend his political capital?
Yeah, I think he shouldn't hesitate to lean in to the issue. There is a consensus across the political spectrum that our immigration system is broken, and that it doesn't serve our communities and our national interest to push millions into the shadows, because that is what is happening today. In terms of moving in on this issue early, I think all of us have kind of highlighted that it is a crowded agenda, and between the pandemic and the economic recession, obviously President-elect Biden will have his hands full. But I also think he's been very clear in conveying his intent. He's indicated he plans to send an immigration bill to Congress on his first day in office that includes a pathway to citizenship for the estimated 11 million immigrants that are living in the country without authorization. He's also said that in his first 100 days, he has an ambitious immigration agenda. It includes ending the Trump administration's most restrictive asylum policies, repealing the Muslim and African bans, reversing the public charge rule, protecting dreamers, as I think we've all discussed, as well as addressing the humanitarian border and the backlog in terms of naturalization. So I think he's been pretty clear on many of those pieces. From his time in the Obama administration, I also think that he's been clear that the incarceration of brown and black people is not the right thing to do. It's not the smart thing to do. And so I think we will hopefully see some investments in alternatives to detention. And I think that, so that's kind of the policies. On the politics of this, I actually think that it's a good approach. We know that public support for immigration and immigrants is actually at an all-time high, perhaps the silver lining of the last 4 years of what has felt like a war on immigration and immigrants. The fact that the majority of Americans, I think it's something like nearly 8 in 10 in a recent Gallup poll, say that they think immigration is a good thing for this country. That's actually the complete inverse from 25 years ago. So I think it's safe to say that there's never been more support for common sense, compassionate solutions. But I do think that, as Senator Flake has noted too, long-term policy rather than executive action is going to require some Republican senators to kind of heed the general public support. And so if this issue is politicized, I think that is where it's going to become potentially politically costly.
Caitlin, do you expect the new administration to stick its neck out here legislatively? How much does this depend on Senate control?
I think that what Senator Flake said was exactly right, that legislatively, President-elect Biden can stick his neck out, he can stick his arm out, he can stick his leg out, but not much is going to happen, and I don't think it really matters. And so I think the biggest question that Democrats have, who are really passionate about immigration policy change, and the biggest question that advocates have is whether President-elect Biden is going to stick his neck out, if we want to continue with that figure of speech, in terms of taking a page out of President Trump's book and using executive authority to the fullest extent possible to push through various immigration policies. I do think, I hate to do the crystal ball thing as a reporter, but I do think if we had to guess that an issue like supporting Dreamers, it's low-hanging fruit, quite frankly, for President-elect Biden. It's something that there has been, incredibly, overwhelmingly, consensus support around for many years, and he has little to lose, right? In terms of pulling executive authority together to support protecting in a more meaningful and substantive way Dreamers. And I think the bigger question for me as a journalist is some of the tougher policy changes, around things like street enforcement of immigrants living in the United States without legal status, or allowing asylum policy to evolve in order to address different types of humanitarian challenges that people are facing around the world now, and whether the U.S. wants to expand its asylum policy to allow them in as well, or to try to maintain, the status quo and say, sorry that you're going through something difficult, but that's not what asylum policy was created for, which I think is how President Trump talked about and pursued change around the issues of asylum, for example. So I'm more curious whether, the Democratic Party, and whether President-elect Biden is going to use his executive authority to try to change some of these more controversial immigration policies. But I wouldn't be surprised to see him throw support behind Dreamers pretty quickly.
Senator Flake, DACA and the people protected by it, deferred action for childhood arrivals, they've become the de facto immigration political bargaining chip. In 2018 budget negotiations, House Republicans presented Democrats with the choice of supporting funding for DACA or for the Children's Health Insurance Program. Is there a feasible path to actually get DACA done? What would Republicans need to get in order to pass to regularize the status of Dreamers, to sort of pass a clean bill, as they say? Do you see this in the future?
Well, that always has been the low-hanging fruit, as Caitlin put it. When I got to Congress, 20 years ago, I supported it, then called the DREAM Act, and that's something we felt we could have passed on its own, but we kind of use that as sweetener for other more difficult parts of comprehensive legislation. There came a time when Republicans were in control that we couldn't pass that on its own, alone. But I do think that there's no downside for President-elect Biden to push this issue. It still may be more difficult to move through absent court action that forces the Congress to move. Simply because there's no incentive really, I think, among Republicans right now to move on this issue that they feel, hey, this population is protected anyway by the court. We can just leave that alone. Of course, they're in limbo here. They don't have any long-term protections and simply can't plan for the future. So it's an awful thing for them. But I just don't see Republicans unless the court comes back. If the court comes back and says, hey, this is unconstitutional, they may take that position and force the Congress into action. Then this is an excellent opportunity for President Biden and his administration to work with Republicans in Congress who say, well, we're certainly not going to deport these individuals. We have another population of 11 million or whatever else that we need to deal with as well. But this is something easy to do. So I hope and I would expect the Biden administration to lean in on that issue. There's no downside. And if the court comes back, I think that action can be taken with Republican support on that narrow issue.
You know, among the Republicans in the 2013 Gang of Eight, you and your fellow Arizona Senator, the late John McCain, you have always maintained your compromised vision on immigration. The other two Republicans in the Gang of Eight, Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham, have since embraced Trump's fear-mongering about immigration. Is it telling about the Republican Party that one-time immigration moderates are either leaving government or changing their views to be more extreme?
Yes, it is, and it was certainly disappointing to see, how politics intervened after the Gang of Eight bill passed the Senate and then didn't go through the House. And I think Mario kind of felt he was burned by it with the base, and Lindsey as well. So, yeah, I frankly think Lindsey will be back on this issue when he has the space, when he feels he can, because that's where his heart is. Mario, I'm not so sure where he's going to be. He's going to tiptoe into this carefully, I think, not knowing where the base is. And I say that just because of other statements he's made on other issues that seem like he's very eager to be where the base of the party is. So yeah, it has been disappointing to see this issue that was the consensus issue among Republicans now be much more difficult.
It's interesting because politics in Arizona, your home state, has changed tremendously in the last 4 years. In 2016, Arizona had 2 Republican senators, and Joe Arpaio was finishing his 4th term as Maricopa County Sheriff. Now the state has 2 Democratic senators, and the state voted for a Democratic president for only the 2nd time in 70 years. Can you talk us through what's happened here, and how connected is this to immigration policy, or perhaps to the legacy of John McCain, maybe to your own politics?
Well, Arizona is changing, definitely, demographically. And over time, we're going to look more like Colorado and Nevada. But that doesn't explain where Arizona is right now. If in Arizona, if you run as a Republican for mine inspector, for example, and we do have a mine inspector that runs statewide in Arizona, just having an R behind your name is enough to win statewide. And that's still the case for most, positions that don't get any attention. Republicans still have a voter registration advantage of nearly 200,000. Most independents tend to lean Republican. So I wouldn't put Arizona in the purple category yet. In one sense, I think it's just Arizonans, to their credit, I think have rejected Trumpian kind of politics. And some of that has to do with the president's views and his rhetoric and style, if you will, on immigration and, the nativism there. Some of it's pushed back, but a lot of it is just pushed back against the president's behavior generally on other issues. So yeah, as a Republican, I can tell you, it's kind of painful to see, for the first time in 70 years, 2 Democrats in that position. But I think that's more a function right now, although demographic trends are affecting the state. It's more a function right now of a rejection of Trumpian politics, and I'm happy to see that happen.
Thanks so much. All right. Well, let me remind our viewers that if you'd like to ask questions, don't forget to put those questions in the chat box, and we'll get to them soon at the top of the hour. I'd like to pivot our discussion to some different types of immigrant arrivals. Krish, prior to the Trump administration, refugee resettlement was a pretty anonymous endeavor. It was not a big national flashpoint of debate. It was pretty anonymous. It's a political wedge issue in many places. What is the plan for not only trying to combat negative perceptions of refugee resettlement, but also trying to capitalize on the national attention on the issue? Are there upsides to getting caught in the spotlight?
Yeah, it's true that, refugee resettlement programming has actually historically received broad bipartisan support for decades. We actually resettled more refugees under Republican administrations than Democratic ones. President Reagan actually resettled the highest number of refugees of any president in our history. But it also, it flew under the radar of the general public for some time. And I think that, one of the lessons of the last 4 years is that we have to be proactive rather than reactive in terms of laying the groundwork of what we do, why we do it, who we serve, and how that helps America. So I think, a few of the things that we've been thinking about learning from the last 4 years. So first, I think we need to just make sure that people have the facts. There is undoubtedly a lot of misinformation around refugees. When President Trump was in Minnesota, which has received a number of Somali Americans, who were refugees, talking about them as criminals or Islamic terrorists, that just couldn't be, farther from the truth. And so there needs to be a discussion around who refugees are and refugee policy that is actually rooted in reality. But, let's be honest, there are a lot of people out there who are not going to be moved by data and statistics. And so that's where I think that we need to ramp up storytelling campaigns, build proximity between refugees and those who may not have ever come in contact with refugees, because I think starting from this common place of humanity or something that could actually burst this bubble of the other, which I think sometimes political leaders are exploiting, I think could be helpful. I can wax poetic about the economic contributions of refugees and drown you in figures and facts, but I'm not sure that would leave as lasting an impression as if I talked about Joseph, who is someone that we'd resettled, a Liberian refugee who spent, most of his childhood growing up in refugee camps, overcame homelessness and became a police officer in Washington, D.C. Or the story of a young woman named Dazar who her family had to flee Iraq. Her father had helped American forces rebuild in their hometown. And now she's, safe here studying in America at a college. She's volunteering for her resettlement office. Obviously you mentioned my own personal story. My parents were ethnic Tamil and religious minorities in Sri Lanka, and we left a country that was on the brink of civil war. And it was that, opportunity to come to America when my parents had no jobs, just a couple $100s in their pockets and two very young kids in their arms, which, created my American story. My parents were both public school teachers in Baltimore City. And I now get to lead a national organization that resettles refugees. So that's where I just think that we have an opportunity because the national spotlight is on this issue. And so it's about using that, making sure that people understand who refugees are, what they can do to actually take action so that political leaders hear their voices and understand that there is broader support. And then just the final point I'll make, we certainly learned from President Trump's executive order that allowed governors, local community leaders to either, affirm or reject refugee resettlement, that having that grassroots support matters. We have it. 42 governors affirmed their willingness to accept refugees. The one governor, Governor Abbott, was, in Texas, was the one who rejected it. So there is some strong groundwork, but we have to build on it.
Yeah, and these are some of the most vulnerable people in the world, of course. And relatedly, Caitlin, you've written multiple stories about asylum seekers who are staying in a large camp in Matamoros, right across the border in Mexico, where they wait for their asylum cases to be heard. My Schar School colleague, Guadalupe Correa Cabrera, has recently published research arguing that recent caravans and mass migrations respond not only to human vulnerability, but also to Trump's restrictive border controls. If we just peel away every layer of abstraction here, what is Biden likely to do, or what should he do, that can change what those people are going through right now? Can you maybe share a little bit about that story?
Sure. So, like you mentioned, I started going to the Mexican side of the border, as soon as accumulations began to grow in the early days of President Trump's administration. They started with the increase of the use of this practice called metering, which limited the number of people who could cross the border each day through legal ports of entry by requesting asylum. And then the accumulations just exploded exponentially in size because of the introduction of MPP, or the Remain in Mexico policy, as it's sometimes known, which actually requires, as many people here will know, asylum seekers to wait out the entirety of their legal cases on the Mexican side of the border. And those cases tend to take months or years. And so these refugee camps, de facto refugee camps, popped up on the Mexican side of the border, although one really important factor about them is that basically the UNHCR was not consulted when MPP was introduced. I talked to the head of that institution's office in Monterrey, Mexico, who said, we were never consulted about MPP. We didn't know that it was coming, and neither the American nor Mexican government spoke to us about it, declared any of these areas as official refugee camps, or asked for resources to support them. And so you have these de facto refugee camps, but without the infrastructure for basic sanitation, and water and clean food and hygiene that you would have in other parts of the world. Although, of course, refugee camps are never ideal circumstances to be living in. So to answer your question about what happens once President-elect Biden takes office, he's made very clear that in his first 100 days, he'd like to eliminate that MPP policy, which would, in theory, allow people living in the camps to enter the United States pretty quickly or be rejected, to have their cases expeditiously reviewed one way or the other, but they would no longer be required to wait in Mexico. But I want to point out that, that the UNHCR, for example, wanted to make sure that my stories communicated that those camps really are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of showing the number of people who've been impacted by MPP. The most recent figures, I think, are above 70,000 people who've been enrolled in the program. I'm a little skeptical of those numbers because the way that the Trump administration has dealt with immigration statistics has at times been a bit indiscernible or even a little bit misleading. I think I discovered at a certain point that they were enrolling people in MPP, even people who wanted to request voluntary departure. So we know they wanted to go back to their home country rather than wait out their case. But the administration was enrolling them in MPP anyway, so that when their court date came up, people wouldn't be there. They would get a deportation order in absentia, which would then prevent them from being able to access legal pathways to immigration later. So the numbers are a little fuzzy, but the point is that the numbers of people in the refugee camps are really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of all those people who've been impacted by the policy. Most of them have tried to find safety elsewhere, have been absorbed into the sort of crevices of Mexican society, but are in a lot of danger. And we've written many stories about folks who've been kidnapped and been exposed to physical assault, sexual assault, really at the mercy of gangs that control the areas where they've been forced to live as a result of these policies. And so you may see MPP roll back within those first 100 days, as President-elect Biden is committed to doing, but still you have a really lasting impact for the tens of thousands who fell under the policy to begin with. And then, as I said, we're going to have to see those sort of softer implications because of the ripple effect that American immigration policy has that changes migration flows. And we're just going to have to see where things land once that policy is wound down.
Well, thanks so much for that impactful reporting that you're doing too. Senator Flake, you have been a proponent of more economic and skill-based immigration to the U.S. My Schar School colleague, Professor Jack Goldstone, recently published an article arguing that the United States should broaden its focus to not only consider immigrants' labor skills, but also their entrepreneurship, which is also often harder to measure, of course. From Andrew Carnegie to Andrew Grove, poor and unskilled immigrants have built great industries, employing hundreds of thousands of people and creating billions of dollars of wealth, he writes. Goldstone also found that skill-based entries help less with demographic aging. What is the best balance between the sort of tradition of family migration that the United States has had, which makes us very unique in the rest of the world, which often admits less skilled immigrants, and selecting immigrants for the credentials that they possess?
Well, as you mentioned, I think we've got to have a good mix between the two. I've long supported more high-skilled immigration. I introduced what I called the Staple Act when I was back in my House days, more than a decade ago. after hearing Bill Gates and others talk endlessly that we ought to staple a green card to the diploma of anybody, a graduate, anybody who gets a graduate degree here in our universities in any of the STEM fields. And so I introduced legislation to that effect, and we basically included that and actually broadened it and strengthened it in the bipartisan bill that we passed in the Senate. So I still support, increased high-skilled immigration and allowing individuals who come here and are educated in our universities to have a path to stay. But also, I see the value of those who come with fewer skills. And I mentioned in a New York Times op-ed I wrote years ago, my own experience growing up on a cattle ranch and a farm in northern Arizona. And we had obviously a lot of Mexican migrant labor that came. I should point out, it wasn't illegal at that time to hire them. Their presence was illegal, but I talked about one man by the name of Manuel who worked in some fashion on our farm for nearly 24 years. He came initially as an illegal immigrant and later was able to get a green card and raise his family in my hometown, 6 kids, all of whom have gone on to do great things. And I talked about how we ought to admit people whose only qualification is the eagerness to work and to create jobs and to be an entrepreneur. So I truly believe that we need to strike a balance. We tried to do that in the bipartisan bill. We took some of the visas that the family-based visas and put them in another category, but we left a healthy amount there. And there should always be a place for some family migration and for those with lesser skills who simply want to come and work and be a productive member of society here.
Caitlin, has Trump's support for points-based systems, which in some ways would achieve precisely what Senator Flake was just describing, points-based systems, which were once backed by many moderate Democrats, along with many Republicans, has his support for Trump for points-based systems tarnished American perceptions for what is otherwise a pretty sophisticated policy route that's used by many of the United States peer countries?
I don't think so. Points-based systems are one approach of trying to, as we've been talking about, elevate in importance the specific skills that people can contribute to the American economy if they're allowed to immigrate. There are other ways of doing it. And I don't think that President Trump's support for that kind of a policy, the kind of most extreme or aggressive version of it, I think takes it off the table in any way. I think that, in theory, sort of a reasonable discussion of that type of a policy taken in concert with a family-based system as well, which is right now the bedrock of the American immigration system. It may, eventually make up a smaller portion of the justification for immigration, and points or skills may, it really just depends on the political winds, take a larger percentage of the population of people who are allowed in to immigrate. I don't think that, that those will at any point be taken off of the table. I think really it's just a balancing act. There are so many different groups and so many different factors and groups supporting them when it comes to trying to create a comprehensive, immigration system. You've got the family-based visas, you've got employment-based visas, you've got asylees, you've got the diversity lottery, and I think there's a balancing act there. But I don't think there's any reason why a points-based system for skilled immigration should be or would be taken off the table.
Very interesting. Okay, well, time will obviously tell. Let me just take this moment to remind our viewers that you should join us next week around the same time at 12 noon on Friday. We're going to have a fantastic panel with us to discuss climate change policy. Is going to be Janie Bavishi from the Office of Resiliency in New York City. She works looking out for climate change for Bill de Blasio in the city of New York. Andrew Light, who has previously worked under the special representative for climate change at the State Department, and Rob Meyer from The Atlantic, who covers climate change and environmental politics and technology for The Atlantic. Don't forget to miss that. Don't miss that on Friday at 12 noon next week. For now, we'll take a quick break and we'll come right back with your questions.
A world in motion. Our next generation of leaders needs new tools, sharper skills, leadership vision, and policy acumen to succeed in today's environment. A hands-on interdisciplinary education that offers a national and global perspective on the complexities of governance. The Schar School, a vision of excellence that melds theory with practice in the spirit of advancing the public good.
All right, welcome back to the Schar School Power Lunch. We're looking forward to getting your questions. I'm joined again by Senator Jeff Flake, Caitlin Dickerson from the New York Times, and Krish Vignarajah from Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Services. Let's take a look at our first question. It comes from Aubrey Grant, who writes, "Some have suggested that the U.S. refugee admissions program could be modernized by including private sponsorship. Is this a politically viable option for reforming resettlement during the next administration?" I think, Krish, this is really best answered by you.
Sure. It's a great question, especially in the last couple years as President Trump decimated the refugee resettlement infrastructure and reduced the presidential determination, basically the ceiling or the target for how many refugees can come into the U.S. There have been discussions on whether we could essentially privatize this program. If we had 4 more years, I think it would be particularly worthy of discussion. But candidly, I think there's probably a better approach of kind of a hybrid version. We talk about this as community co-sponsorship. So it's essentially how you can have the refugee resettlement infrastructure that works with the State Department working with communities across the country. And we very much support co-sponsorship where you have community groups, churches, other local entities supporting new refugee families in partnership with resettlement agencies. That way you have kind of the shared responsibilities for outcomes. That way you ensure that, after the very limited 3 months of federal support that exist, you have a community that can help refugees in terms of skills integrating into the community, language skills, finding employment. This is actually something where if you have the proper oversight, I think there's a lot of opportunity to improve the integration of refugees. It's also a way to build capacity. So when we talk about going from the current number under President Trump of 15,000 and increasing that to 125,000, community co-sponsorship is really going to be a critical component of that. And it's not unprecedented. In the early days of the refugee system here, we had embraced a community co-sponsorship model. So I think that just as many other programs are thinking about public-private partnerships, this is definitely one that I think should be integrated into the U.S. system.
Fascinating. All right, let's take a look at the next question. This comes from Wendy Felice, my dear colleague from the American Immigration Council, who is actually one of a former Power Lunch panelist herself from week 2. She asks, should immigration reform legislation continue to be a standalone effort, or should it be part and parcel of other important must-pass bills ahead around healthcare, infrastructure, and the economy? I think this is a great question for Senator Flake. And Caitlin, you may also have some strong thoughts about this too. Senator.
Well, I've always been a fan of comprehensive reform simply because, there's elements that you have to get that can only be packaged as part of a broader deal. But having said that, I just don't see that on the horizon. I don't see, any compelling reason that Republicans will support that. So I would take it where you can get it. And like I said, some of it may be in response to court challenges that force congressional action. That'll be the case, I think, on the DACA issue. So, take it up as freestanding individual piece of legislation or attached to something else. I just say you take it where you can get it. And I think we, for too long, have tried to hold the more popular parts, the more consensus parts of this legislation, waiting for, a bigger bill that we can never get. So take it where you can get it.
Yeah, the Congress seems to be doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Caitlin, we'll come back and discuss this maybe all together, but Caitlin, do you agree with Senator Flake? Is this the only way forward to kind of try something new here?
I think Senator Flake really is the authority on this. And yeah, I was nodding at the idea of hearing what he had to say, but it certainly makes a lot of sense. If you look at the prior comprehensive reform bills, they're so vast. They touch on so many different issues and so many issues that are, controversial for different reasons, quite frankly. And so you could imagine an approach where something like a bill to provide a pathway to citizenship for Dreamers was attached to something else, must pass, some other kind of low-ish hanging fruit. Maybe going back to the idea of DAPA that President Obama introduced, similar protections, but for the parents of Dreamers. Things having to do with asylum, things having to do with other humanitarian, sort of non-controversial humanitarian groups. Those are policy issues I could imagine being chiseled off and attached to must-pass bills. But there's still going to be a lot of contention because there's a lot more controversial, I think, policy, especially having to do with ICE enforcement, that people really see differently on, in terms of the general public. And that's going to be the more difficult challenge for the next Congress.
If I could just follow up on that, if I can. Caitlin makes an important point about, maybe if you pass something on DACA, then you can go with DAPA. Success begets success. And when you have a successful effort on a smaller piece, then it often paves the way to do the other. But waiting for, the big one, it's always the white whale. In the House, I did, Flake Colby, Flake Gutierrez is involved in the McCain-Kennedy efforts, the Senate and the House together, and then the other one in the Senate. So I think so many people in Congress have been down that road too many times before. But success can beget success. So let's do the smaller pieces.
It's very interesting to hear your perspective on this too. Let's take a look at the next question here. This is from Chris Price. Chris asks, how should the new administration improve our immigration system for large-scale events that will increase the need for safe immigration, such as climate change? It's such an interesting question, Chris, because there really is no such thing as climate change visas. No country really has them yet. And yet this is a sort of a form of refuge, just not one that's recognized at the international level. Krish, at Lears, have you guys begun discussing the prospect for climate change refugees, even though it's not actually recognized as a form of humanitarian migration at the international level yet?
Yeah, we have, and this is definitely a priority area that I'm especially focused on. During the UN Climate Week, we actually hosted a panel discussion on this, and then we actually had another panel called God, Climate, and Migration, because we know that this is something that isn't futuristic. It's actually what we're experiencing today. When you look at migrants right now, 2/3 of migrants are being displaced either as a primary reason or a secondary reason as a result of a climate factor. And we're seeing that not just abroad, but even here at home. I just had a call earlier this morning with a filmmaker focusing on Louisiana. And I talked about how, we're looking at the indigenous population living on Ile de Jean Charles, who are going to have to resettle, but it's not unique to Louisiana, even in Alaska. You look at communities like Shishmaref, where American citizens are going to be receiving taxpayer dollars in order to resettle. So, as you noted, Justin, it is a real problem that the UN, no country has recognized an avenue for these individuals to be resettled. I actually testified before the Senate Climate Crisis Task Force when Senator Markey had produced a bill proposing to create an allocation of 50,000 that could be resettled. I think there is a real opportunity. We need to act now because it isn't going to be in 50 years, 100 years that we're looking. It's a reality we're facing today.
The closest thing to my knowledge about this is around a decade ago, I think New Zealand freed up about 10,000 visas for a country in the South Pacific that was being submerged by rising seas. But they actually did not designate it as climate change visas because they were scared of the precedent that it was going to set. And so they basically didn't call it climate change visas, even though that it was de facto for those purposes. And so there is a concern for the precedent because, you know, if a country like Bangladesh were suddenly submerged by rising sea levels or enormous floods, you could have millions of people that would be entitled to migration, and neighboring countries who may have climate change visas or other countries around the world simply couldn't sustain it. So it could be an enormous logistical problem and obviously policy problem thereafter. Caitlin, I also wondered if in your reporting, if you're hearing anything from the Texas border after the hurricanes that hit Central America. There's new reporting actually in the New York Times about how this could lead to new flows of humanitarian migration. And, you know, when you have this kind of migration, these are forced migrants. They're just not refugees because they're not recognized as refugees by the international system, but they're clearly forced because they're not voluntarily leaving their homes. They simply can't stay where they are because they've been destroyed.
That's right. And I think that the American immigration system does have a precedent for taking in groups like that. And it depends on the politics of the moment, and it depends who's president at the moment. But, you know, other ways that the United States could begin to allow in refugees, people seeking refuge based on climate change or its impacts on their home countries, are either expansion of asylum, and I talked about that earlier, you know, whether President Biden, when he takes office, and whether really his attorney general, who has more direct impact on asylum policy, that basically the decisions of immigration judges, whether they're encouraged through decisions that come down via an attorney general's office to allow asylum policy to expand and evolve over time. So under President Obama, people might remember that asylum decisions in immigration court basically expanded and grew to address different political circumstances of the time, so that women who were exposed to gender-based violence, which had become, you know, at that point an epidemic in Central America, were eligible for asylum. And you could see similarly immigration judges start to make decisions that have precedent, or an attorney general introduce a memo that has precedent that allows for people to get asylum based on, you know, a climate change claim. That's not an unreasonable thing to expect. It's certainly something that folks who agree with President Trump's immigration policies would you know, vehemently disagree with. But based on the way that policy has evolved over time, you could see it happening. And you could also see something like the use of TPS, temporary protected status, which has been applied in the past in places like El Salvador, Haiti, places that have, you know, very extreme weather and extreme climate change events, and they're given temporary status in the United States, people from those places. But that status is very vulnerable and subject to change in political winds, and that's why we saw, you know, so much consternation under President Trump's time in office, because he eliminated TPS status for people from several different countries, and that really, you know, puts them in limbo. So you could see the Biden administration pursue TPS for people fleeing climate change. But, you know, I think there will probably be a wariness, because the last 4 years have taught us just how vulnerable that status can be to a change in political power.
Yeah, and of course, it's also helping the people who are here rather than the folks who are obviously needing refuge at the moment. Let's take a look at the next question. This is from Amanda Tran, who asks, how has SIV, and that refers to Special Immigrant Visa Settlement, been affected in the last months of the Trump administration? Could SIV resettlement be a potential area of cooperation between Republicans and Democrats? And for our audience's sake, SIVs usually refer to the visas for people who have helped the U.S. military or diplomats abroad in most cases, and then are given a granted visa status in the United States, often in many cases to protect them from retribution in their home countries. I wonder if Krish, if you want to actually take this question first.
Yeah, happy to. It's a great question, because This is where we have not seen as significant dips under President Trump as in other areas. I think in the last fiscal year, so FY20, we resettled a little less than 10,000 refugees. And I think in these last few months, we've resettled probably a little less than 500, maybe something like 470. I think this is definitely a potential area of bipartisan cooperation, given the profile of those who are eligible for SIV status. These are people who have risked their lives and those of their families to assist U.S. missions abroad as translators, as drivers. This is a very different definition of supporting our troops, because supporting them also means keeping our word to those who risk their lives and the lives of their family to protect American personnel and interests. So this is where it is a key matter of foreign policy and diplomacy. It is going to be incredibly difficult to recruit allies in our global efforts to combat extremism if the U.S. Turns back on its promises to those that it intended to protect. And this is where there is actually some interesting synergies. Some of our most vocal supporters are from the national security space. So a couple of years ago, General Mattis penned a letter saying that for national security reasons, the lowest number that should be resettled in terms of refugees and SIVs actually use the same infrastructure as refugees, that the lowest number needed to be 45,000.
It's interesting. Senator Flake, do you think that your former Republican colleagues in Congress would be more amenable to this kind of reform or expansion?
Yes, I do. There has been support among Republicans who want to be seen, obviously, as supporting troops and supporting efforts to support our troops overseas. So yes. Let me address the prior question if I can. There's one immediate example of climate change refugees, if you will. This is kind of a special case because these individuals hold U.S. passports. In the Republic of the Marshall Islands, which I've traveled to a number of times, there are some 60,000 individuals there scattered on a number of islands, none of which are more than 6 or 8 feet above sea level. About a quarter of the Marshallese population is already in the United States, and in the coming decades, it could be, if things continue as they are, that all of them will be here. So we're going to see situations like that. That's not a pure immigration issue because while they're not U.S. citizens, they carry passports. We have a compact of free association with the Marshallese, but you're going to see a number of situations like this come up.
And thanks so much. All right, let's take a look at the final question for the day. This is from Timothy Young, who asks, what are some proven models of alternatives to detention for asylum-seeking families? Caitlin, I wonder if this is actually best up your alley.
Sure. So just for some context before I jump in, asylum-seeking families historically, before President Trump took office, were often allowed into the United States so that their cases could be heard. But there was a big shift under which families were either required to wait in Mexico under that MPP policy we discussed, or mandatorily detained for extended periods of time while their cases were being heard. And so as a way to draw down the immigration detention system under President Obama, the Department of Homeland Security started exploring, with the help of advocacy groups, alternatives, ways to allow people to move freely while their cases were wending their ways through the very lengthy process that is going through the immigration court system. And so alternatives to detention that were effective were things like using GPS ankle monitors to keep track of people's whereabouts, but I think even more so just education, really. So basically it was a social worker type program or a caseworker type program where families were assigned somebody who could educate them about where immigration court was, when they needed to be there, what the rules they needed to follow were, what the process they needed to follow was. And it really helped to address this issue of people not showing up for immigration court. You know, it's one of the most frequently invoked justifications for these more restrictive measures, like mandatorily detaining asylum seekers or requiring them to wait in Mexico rather than the United States where their cases are heard, because there are such large numbers of in absentia deportation orders. And, you know, I think a couple different things are true. It is true that, you know, a lot of people don't show up for immigration court. At the same time, I've written, you know, countless stories and interviewed countless people who never got their notice of where they were supposed to go to immigration court, or were given a notice that said one thing and then actually they were supposed to be in court at a different time. You know, the immigration court system is one of the most bogged down and really in need of reform federal agencies that I've interacted with as a journalist. And so a lot of those no-show rates, it turned out, were really caused by just the fact that people didn't know, you know, were uninformed about the system, or basically faulty paperwork led to a mishap that granted them ultimately a deportation order in absentia. And so the alternatives to detention have been really effective in that space.
And Chris, your organization has actually even piloted some of these techniques, right?
Yeah. So, you know, what I think is important to realize is that alternatives to detention, ATD, is often not just kind of the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. When you think about the fact that right now we actually have children who are in family detention against a federal court ruling, because ICE hasn't put a third option on the table. So with these children, basically the parents have been presented with a binary choice: either keep the kids with them in detention during a pandemic, or release the children, but the parents are going to be held. And our point is that when you employ alternatives to detention, we could take care of both the parents and the children without making the parents face this impossible choice. But the reason why I also say it's a smart thing to do is, as Caitlin said, you know, the compliance rates that we achieved in some of our pilots were more than 99%. I mean, they were near perfect in terms of these asylum seekers showing up for their ICE meeting as well as their legal hearing. It comes based on you know, a community-based approach where we can find the resources in the community, and it comes at a fraction of the cost. And I think that's really important, because when we talk about the resources in the immigration system, 80% of those who are held in immigration detention are held by private prison companies. GEO and CoreCivic just last year earned $1.4 billion in ICE contracts. And so, you know, when you look at kind of the choices that we're facing, I don't think they're kind of Republican against Democratic options. I think it's really what's smart and sensible and the right thing to do versus industry. And I think, unfortunately, as private prison companies thankfully got pushed out of domestic penitentiary systems due to criminal justice reform, they look to immigration as the new profit center. And so I hope actually that a Biden administration will take on this issue.
Another space to watch. I mean, this is such an issue in motion, if you'll excuse the pun. There's still a lot going, even though it is relatively to the previous years under the radar. No doubt there are new developments to come. Thank you all for your excellent contributions and really sophisticated ideas today. What a fantastic panel. Don't forget to join us next week on December 11th. At noon, we'll be discussing climate change policy with another really fantastic, highly qualified panel. Janie Bavishi from New York City, Andrew Light, previously at the State Department, now a university professor at Mason, and Rob Meyer from The Atlantic, one of the best reporters out there on the subject matter. Until then, thank you to everyone here on the mainland, and to Senator Jeff Flake. Mahalo nui loa. Have a great day, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.